So you've had a really interesting trajectory. The Paleo Mom, you built this enormous brand for yourself. And then did you create AIP?
I was very important for popularizing it.
Interesting.
And deepening its base. But I wasn't the original. Like, the original creators were Rob Wolf and Lauren Cordain.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, well, I want to get into all the things, but I'm super excited about your new book, Nutrivore.
Yeah.
So what is Nutrivore, and how can we use this algorithm that you've developed to feel better, get healthier, lose weight, all the things?
So Nutrivore is just the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. So you can trace back my nutrient dense geek origins back to my earliest beginnings in the wellness community. But I think I recognized over time that as we as a community embraced more and more food fear and more restrictive mindsets, that we were digging a big hole for ourselves, which was increasing nutrient shortfalls. And of course that extends to everybody. There's 4 essential nutrients for which 90% or more of Americans don't get enough of from their diets. There's 10 essential nutrients for which half or more of Americans don't get enough of from their diets. And the problem with that is nutrient shortfalls interact with things like genetics and lifestyle and other health-related behaviors to really amp up our risk for chronic health problems. And so watching that happen, right, that hole that we're digging in a community driven by sort of a restrictive mindset to food was a really big, eye-opening moment for me. So I committed my time and energy and my team to developing resources to help everyone, right? Paleo, AIP, vegan, carnivore, keto, low carb, low fat, all of these different diets, or anti-diet, intuitive eating, to develop tools and resources to help redirect those food choices towards more nutrient-dense foods in such a way that we can meet our nutritional needs within our chosen diet or within a chosen anti-diet. I would say Nutrivore kind of lives in that weird space because it's a dietary philosophy. It's not a dietary structure. There's no food you have to eat, no food you have to avoid. It lives in that weird space in between diet and anti-diet where we care about diet quality and increasing our nutrient intake. But the default setting on Nutrivore would be to do this as an anti-diet. So do this in a permissive structure where no food is off the table.
I love that. I want to get into the specifics. You said that there are 4 nutrients for which 90% of Americans are deficient or inadequate.
Insufficient. Yeah. So not hitting the daily value hardly ever, or certainly not on average, from their diets. So the top is vitamin D, and it's 99.9999, round up to 100%. And I feel like we should always put vitamin D in its own little bucket because it is kind of a weird nutrient in the sense that it is essential. We can absolutely use vitamin D from food. We also make our own vitamin D. And so as a steroid hormone, we kind of stick vitamin D over here, right? Because that's a more nuanced conversation. We don't just need to get vitamin D from our diet, but all of the other essential nutrients we necessarily have to get them from food. So all other 48 essential nutrients we have to get from food. The next most common nutrient insufficiency is potassium. 97.8% of Americans don't get enough potassium from their diets. Potassium is really important. So potassium and sodium work on opposite sides of the cell membrane to drive that sort of electrical current across the membrane. So it's important for everything that needs electrical current. So our heart beating, our muscles contracting, our nerve impulses, but it's also utilized by our kidneys to help control blood pressure. So not getting enough potassium just by itself can increase blood pressure. That increases risk of cardiovascular disease, but also chronic kidney disease, and potassium also has a link to skeletal health. So not getting enough potassium can also increase risk of osteoporosis. That's almost everyone, right? Nearly 98% of people are not getting enough potassium.
Wow.
The next most common nutrient insufficiency is vitamin E. It's 96.2%, something like that. Vitamin E is our most important fat-soluble antioxidant, right? So we need antioxidants to counteract aging, right? All of the oxygen radicals that our bodies produce as a result of normal metabolism. We need antioxidants, and we need those antioxidants to be in the place where the oxidants are produced. So we have all these water-soluble antioxidants from our diet, right? Vitamin C, polyphenols, right? All of the antioxidant phytonutrients. those can all be in water-soluble areas of the body, right? Inside the cell, right? Inside the cytosol. We need the fat-soluble antioxidants to work where we're in a fat-soluble, like the cell membrane, right? We need those fat-soluble antioxidants to work where we're in a fat-soluble environment. And vitamin E is our primary fat-soluble antioxidant.
It's really important for brain health.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of the things that's really interesting when we start zooming in on nutrients. Almost every biological system uses almost every nutrient, right? Like really, there's always the primary ones that we always want to talk about. Like B vitamins are so important for metabolism, and every cell needs to make ATP to be able to fuel all of the chemical reactions that it does to be it. But really, there's no biological system that isn't going to use every nutrient to some degree.
Interesting. So cool. And vitamin E, one of the other primary roles is it helps fight against lipid peroxidation.
Yes.
Right? So like basically the chemical derangement of cellular membranes, among other things.
So vitamin E is really, really important for how susceptible LDL cholesterol is to oxidation, and getting more vitamin E can dramatically reduce the production of oxalams, oxidized metabolites of linoleic acid, which increased oxalam production is associated with a variety of health conditions. And there's interesting research. It's very preliminary. I don't think we can say firm numbers from it yet, but that basically for every gram of polyunsaturated fats, which are the most easily oxidized, we eat per day, we need an additional 0.6 milligrams of vitamin E. Fuzzy numbers. I mean, I know those were really precise numbers I just said, but we'll just take them with a grain of salt is what I mean.
Yeah, but the general gist is the more polyunsaturated fatty acids we consume, the more PUFAs we consume, the higher our requirements are for vitamin E.
Yes, and I feel like we don't, this is really fascinating nuance in the conversation of nutrition that most people don't have a base knowledge to be able to have this conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the big challenges we have in the wellness community, LeBron, to everywhere, is the fact that when we graduate high school, right, we've got some good grammar knowledge. We maybe know algebra, right? We can do some basic math. We've maybe taken a civics class, right? We've got this broad knowledge base that we're sort of expected to have when we graduate high school. Nowhere in there is nutrition, right? You take a 1-week unit in the middle of one health class in the middle of high school, and all you kind of learn is, right, good foods, bad foods, right? Junk food and, my plate. And it does in no way are our kids or us as adults learning about vitamins, minerals, antioxidant, phytonutrients, vitamin-like compounds like coenzyme Q10, cool non-proteinogenic amino acids like ergothioneine. We kind of get this really simplistic, choose whole grains, right? We get this really simplistic, I don't even know if we can call it an education, right? It's the lack of knowledge that we have makes us as a society really susceptible to misinformation online and really susceptible to predatory marketing and diet culture, right? The diet that tells you all you need to do is cut out these 7 foods and you'll lose 7 pounds in 7 weeks or whatever it is, right? 7 days. It's probably a more aggressive sales pitch than 7 weeks. And what happens when we credit restriction, the foods that we cut out for whatever initial weight loss success we had when we go on these diets, is when we stop losing weight or we can't stick to that diet anymore. We naturally go, okay, well, what else do I need to cut out, right? What's the next restriction? And I mean, I was in this world as well, right? I was restricting a lot of foods unnecessarily. And it was a really hard realization to realize that I had a learned eating disorder from restricting foods and from that food fear. And that I really had to work through a lot of that food phobia in order to expand my diet and increase my nutrient intake. But that is human nature. If you describe a diet based on what you cut out, then when you are looking for the next diet, because you always will, you're going to look for what's the next level of things I can cut out. Or I've cut out all plant foods, that didn't work for me, now I'll cut out all animal foods, right? Well, that didn't work for me, now I'll cut out all fat. Well, that didn't work for me, now I'll cut out all carbs, right? Well, that didn't work for me. We continue to double down on restrictions. And the problem with restrictions is it's not what you cut out that makes your diet healthy or not. It's what you're actually eating and whether or not the foods you're eating are providing you with the essential nutrients that all of your cells need for all of the chemical reactions that they're performing all of the time that are necessary for those systems to do their jobs that keep us healthy.
I love that. When did the switch flip for you? Because I know for a long time you were an advocate of the paleo diet, which I actually think, I mean, I've never ascribed to the paleo diet myself, but I've always thought that it was a pretty nice, solid paradigm for, just getting back to like minimally processed foods. I always disagreed with the exclusion of legumes and things like that, which I thought were very nutrient dense. And I've never personally excluded legumes or recommended excluding legumes or anything like that. But I've always said that, if you caught me in an elevator and I had 15 seconds to respond to like what kind of diet should I be on among all the different sort of diet tribes, I always kind of thought like the paleo diet was, at least it put more of an emphasis on getting back to whole foods.
Yeah.
And then of course it allowed for the proliferation of like paleo approved ultra processed foods, which we've all seen and, encountered.
Yeah.
When did the switch flip
I
for
wish
you?
I could say there was one like eureka moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm thinking about food wrong. Instead, it was this culmination of like small realizations, but it started, I think it was 2015-ish. My previous publisher pitched me writing a gut health book. And I was like, okay, cool. I know a lot about intestinal permeability, but there's 7,000 books out there about leaky gut. I want to write about the gut microbiome. This is something that there really wasn't much at that time out there, and fascinating, and like this is what I want to learn about. So I started researching the gut microbiome. So the first thing is like expand my knowledge base about something that is not yet my level of expertise, read everything I can, and then start digging into how do different food components impact the composition of the gut microbiome, microbial activity, the postbiotics that are being produced, right? So trying to like wrap my head around this phenomenally complex system. And one of the very first things I encountered was just how phenomenal legumes are for gut microbiome composition and activity. And then I started to zoom out and see these studies showing legumes decreasing risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease and all-cause mortality as a general indicator of health and longevity. And that was my first sort of big like, okay, wait. I have learned fear of legumes through paleo diet dogma. And I think I'm avoiding a food that is really good for me. And I think it might be hurting my health to be afraid of this food. So actually the first food that I added back in my sort of like diet expansion journey was lentils. And I was so convinced that it had to be lentils because of how ridiculously good lentils are for the gut microbiome. And sure enough, I felt amazing. I was like, hang on, that digestion's extra good. We don't need to go into details. That's definitely TMI. Just know that it was very pleasant, and I quite enjoyed the effects of lentils. And so then I was like, okay, well, lentils went great. Now I'm going to try chickpeas and black beans. And I slowly started to add more legumes to my diet and realizing that I had some, amorphous day-to-day symptoms that I was really ignoring and not paying attention to that were resolving. And I was feeling a lot better. So then as I expand my, research into the gut microbiome, I'm like, okay, well, oats. Oats are really fantastic for the gut microbiome. Look at all of these studies showing that oats reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and all-cause mortality, and how they're this super cool source of beta-glucans, this really unique fiber type that we really only get from a few other foods like mushrooms and barley. Okay, well, I'm going to try oats, right? Oh, wow. Oats are working great for me. Then, expand corn. Fantastic for the gut microbiome. So I kept running into these foods that I had a learned food fear of, that I was avoiding, that were so good for the gut microbiome. And then in 2020, just as I was like nearing completion of this book, the contract fell through, and I was left with all of this research I had done into the gut microbiome, this like eye-opening experience of looking at how, because nutrients also impact our gut bacteria, so they can make lots of vitamins, but obviously they can't make minerals because that would be alchemy. And so our nutrient intake has a big effect on them as well. And by 2018, I was starting to think, I think I need to shift gears, right? Like I have expanded my diet. I don't think I can stand by paleo principles anymore. I think I've got some things wrong and I need to start shifting. And in 2020, that was it. I was like, okay, it's time to like rebrand, start talking about the things that I got wrong, start talking about why, talking about this experience of expanding my diet. And over the last 4 years, Nutrivore has kind of taken shape as this diet, anti-diet hybrid thing that it's kind of awkwardly in between diet and anti-diet.
I like that though.
To be fair. But the philosophy of Nutrivore, and especially looking at the psychology of restrictive dieting, kind of came out of the realization that I had this, very disordered eating pattern that had come from, like, both coming into the paleo diet from having a history of binge eating disorder, and then kind of trading my binge eating not really, suppressing somewhat my binge eating disorder for orthorexia, and that I was cutting out so many foods that I didn't need to. In my expansion journey, I'm like, okay, gluten and I don't get along, but that's it. That's the only food that I had restricted out of all of those foods for 10 years that really doesn't work for me. And I think I realized that fear that we're learning from different diets is stopping us from understanding like what foods give us what nutrients and how to choose different foods to get the full range of nutrients that we need. And that was sort of the genesis of Nutrivore was, I think, thinking about what might be in a food that might be harmful to one system is not the right way to think about it. We need to look at how the whole food affects the whole body. And when we look at the whole food, there's nutrients that compensate for, like potentially inflammatory compounds, right? Well, then you have an anti-inflammatory nutrient to compensate. So let's look at how the whole food affects us. And that is the science that I've built Nutrivore on, which is this bigger picture, right? How does eating these foods regularly impact our health risk as a whole? What are the nutrients that this food contains? And that, I think, is where the conversation in terms of what healthy eating looks like needs to go.
Well, I think focusing on nutrient density is so crucial. I mean, it evokes when it's been a long time since I reviewed this stuff, but Bruce Ames' triage theory of aging, that nutrient deficiencies, nutrients are used, as you said, like through all the different tissues of the body for many different processes, some processes that ensure your short-term survival,
right,
while other processes look after your long-term flourishing. And by limiting yourself of any nutrient, magnesium is the one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Specifically, you're potentially handicapping your body's ability to recover from DNA damage and
yeah. So one of the things that happens when we don't have the nutrient resources that our bodies need, so we need to think of nutrients not only as building blocks for everything that makes us, but also as the raw materials that go into all of these chemical reactions that are like the chemical reactions of life, right? The things that keep us alive and keep us going. And when we think of nutrients in that way, they're the things that go into a chemical reaction that get used up. That helps you understand why we need to be continuously topping up our nutrient stores from the foods that we eat. But when we don't get enough nutrients, so if we get like really, really low levels, like less than 10 milligrams of vitamin C, right? That's when you can start to get scurvy. That's a disease of malnutrition, right? You now don't have enough of that nutrient for a really important biochemical process. In this case, it's collagen formation, because vitamin C is a cofactor for collagen formation. And it's the degradation of collagen that causes all of the symptoms of scurvy, right? The bleeding gums and falling out teeth and the rashes and all of that stuff. But there's this weird gray in between being so low in that nutrient that it causes a disease of malnutrition versus like actually getting the daily value, like actually meeting the bare minimum of what we actually need. And in that insufficiency range, in that weird gray with like, I'm not getting what I need, I'm not getting enough, it causes this like wear and tear on the biological systems that use those nutrients. So you have compensation. So you might have a slightly different product made in a chemical reaction, maybe a product that's not as good. Or you might have a byproduct made in a chemical reaction. So you still make the thing that you need to make, but you also make this other thing that can't be, metabolized or detoxified very well. Or you make not enough of the product, right? You slow down that whole chemical reaction. All of those different ways that not getting enough nutrient can impact how a biological system functions, put strain on that system. Now add on top of that, let's say some gene variants that already made that system more susceptible to disease. Now let's add a sedentary lifestyle, or high stress, or not enough sleep, or moderate drinking or smoking. Let's add social determinants of health, right, that cause chronic psychosocial stress, right, on top of that system. Let's add poor, like not enough access to medical care, right? So all of those things now interact to make us very vulnerable to a disease of that system. And we can't change all of those things, right? Like we can't change our social determinants of health. We generally don't have a lot of power over our access to medical care. We certainly can't change our genetics. I mean, maybe a little bit with epigenetics, but generally that goes over generations. But we do have this clear point of intervention, which is nutrition and lifestyle and other health-related behaviors. Together, those account for 40 to 50% of health outcomes. So I think that's also a really important nuance in the conversation of how much health benefit can we get from making big shifts in our diet. I think 40 to 50% is awesome. That's worthwhile. But I think it's also one of the things that I have seen happen in the wellness community is a lot of promises, right? Do these things and you will reverse your disease, you will have this perfect health. And what happens when that doesn't work for a large proportion of people is this sort of like defeated feeling. So I think setting realistic expectations for how far we can get in terms of our health from diet shifts is also a really important part of understanding that give and take, because maybe that'll affect priorities, right? So if I say, okay, I want you to eat 5 servings of vegetables per day. I want you to eat 2 servings of fruit per day. I want every meal, I want your plates to be half fruits and vegetables, a quarter of a whole starchy food and a quarter of a protein food. And you're looking at me going, okay, but where's my cake? Like I want the food that's joyful. I think it's really important to include those quality of life foods in our diet because they ensure that we're getting enough experience and flavor and joy from our healthier diet that we can stick to it. But it's also where we start talking about, okay, well, maybe we're going to tick up a little bit above 10% calories from added sugars from this diet, but we're also getting all of these vegetables and we're also going to be able to live an active lifestyle. And maybe that trade of maybe it's 12% calories from added sugars, right? Maybe that little give and take is going to be worth it for sustainability. And in the end, okay, so if we'd done things perfectly, we would have been able to reduce our risk of things by, let's say, 40 to 50%, and now we're going to get 35 to 40%. Okay, but I was able to stick to it, right? So I think when we insert that nuance into the conversation, we start talking about what each individual needs to make healthy eating sustainable. And I think that is ultimately like the biggest thing I've seen in the wellness community over the last 12 years is that on again, off again. I do the 30-day challenge, and then I fall off the wagon, right? And I think we have that problem across all health-conscious communities is yo-yo dieting. Whether it's weight cycling, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be I lose weight, I gain it all back again. It can just be I'm good, right? I'm doing the thing for this amount of time, and then oh man, no, I've dropped off. I've been eating terribly, right? How many times have you heard that same story? And the fact is, it doesn't matter how I eat today in terms of my long-term health. It doesn't matter what my diet looks like today. It matters what it looks like on average over the next 40, 50, 60 years, if I'm really lucky, right? Like that's what matters. And so what I'm trying to do with Nutrivore is create not a system or a structure, but rather a knowledge base to help inform those choices so that we can shift from diet mentality. I cut out all these foods and I'm going to white knuckle it until I can't do it anymore, and then I'm going to fall off the wagon. So shift from that mentality to adopting healthy eating patterns as lifelong healthy habits. And that's where maybe it won't be 40 to 50%, maybe it'll be 30 to 40%, right? Because maybe it's not as perfect as it could be, but we've set it up in such a way that it's sustainable. And that means it can actually impact long-term health.
Yeah, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think, and you also, to be fair, alluded to this, I think it varies highly individually, like how much a person feels they need to. have a food indulgence on a daily basis in order to sustain their diet. Like
I am a daily basis person.
You're a daily basis person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, 10% of calories from added sugar on a daily basis. Like if I'm consuming 2,000 calories a day, that's 200 calories from added sugar.
That's great.
That's crazy to me.
Oh, it's delicious.
Not everybody, to be fair, I'm sure some people might find that a nice, dangling carrot in order to adhere to whatever, to a healthier dietary pattern. So I like that you offer leeway for people. But again, I think that's pretty variable.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, and if you don't need 10% of your calories from added sugars, I can't say that you need this. There's no reason to get 10% of your calories from added sugars.
There's no biological necessity for added sugar, right?
Not for added suger. I mean, there's a biological necessity for carbohydrates in general, but certainly not for added sugar. I mean, added sugar is giving you added joy. Joy is the ingredient there, right?
Yeah.
But I think that it doesn't matter how healthy your diet is. If you're not enjoying the foods you're eating, you're not going to stick to it.
Fair.
And so I think it's really important to embrace quality of life foods, right? Foods that maybe don't provide me a ton of nutrients, but do provide that joy as a tool for making healthy eating sustainable. They can also be the budget stretching foods, right? The foods that are cultural foods, traditional foods. Maybe they're the thing that I can just throw in the microwave for 2 minutes and voila, there's dinner on a night where I don't get home until 8 p.m., right? Like they can be quality of life foods and more than just flavor. But I think that's why I sort of talk about a permissive approach as opposed to restrictive, because I think so often the message from diet culture is perfect or bust, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like you have to do all of these things. You have to eat just your yes foods or your green light foods or whatever we're going to call them, or good foods, and you have to avoid all of your bad foods. If you eat a bad food, you're a bad person, right? Like we take on these moral judgments of the foods when we eat them. But that is the prevailing message from diet culture. And so if we can switch to, it's okay to have a treat. It's okay to have a cookie or a slice of cake. We're going to focus on the foods that we can add, that are going to add all that invaluable nutrition that the body needs. And we're going to let those crowd out the overabundance in these, we'll call them empty calories for lack of a better term. I don't love the term empty calories, but I don't have anything better for you. We'll let them kind of crowd out.
Because they're joy-filled calories.
Joyful, yeah. Well, why didn't I ever think of that? We'll let them crowd out the overabundance in joyful calories, but not all of them, right? And that way we can come to a situation where we're meeting our nutritional needs. It really only takes for most people 50 to 75% of their caloric intake to hit 100% daily value of all of the nutrients, just by choosing a diversity of whole foods and structuring the majority of our meals in terms of like a quarter starchy food, a quarter protein, half of a plate fruits and vegetables. It's pretty easy to meet our nutritional needs from foods. And that leaves a lot of room for, I get to round this out with my joyful calories and make sure that I'm, adding flavor to my meals. I'm cooking my things with, spices and fats, and like I'm making this in a way that I like. And I think that's not what diets are teaching us right now, which is why I say Nutrivore kind of moves us away from diets.
What would you say are some of the more pervasive diet culture myths circulating on social media today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think we've got there's like myths to me kind of fall into two categories. So one is like the pain of a healthy diet category, and then one is like the fear of foods category. So in terms of like the pain of healthy diet, I think one of the things certainly that I learned, especially having weight cycled as many times as I have, one of the things I kind of learned along the way is like, if you're enjoying the food, it doesn't count, right? So there's a sort of idea that like the only way to eat vegetables is steamed, right? Or raw, and you have to be pretty much choking it back in order for it to count as a healthy food. And I think that just giving people permission to prepare foods in ways that they enjoy is a really important message, right? That's part of that sustainability. Or that you have to live without the foods that you love, right? You have to be deprived, otherwise you're weak, right? You don't have willpower. If you succumb to that slice of cake, it's your fault, right? That's the sort of other part of like the psychology aspect of healthy eating equals pain, right? I think that's one of the worst messages we've gotten from diet culture. But I think the other thing that kind of goes along with restrictive mindsets, which look, we can trace back to low-fat diets from the 1970s, right? This is where it all started. Here's this terrible thing that's in our food, and we're going to cut this out. And then it kind of migrated to low carb in the 90s, and then paleo came up in the early 2000s. Veganism has been there all along. But I think that one of the things that happens when we start thinking of foods as bad foods is we look for reasons for them to be bad. And the reasons have gotten more complex, right? So we find this like little bit of seed of scientific truth, and we build our case around that. And I think right now there's a lot of accessible, affordable, healthy foods that the prevailing message that people are getting is don't eat these foods, they're toxic. Don't eat these foods, they're inflammatory. And I would say the two most like prevalent of those is the fear around vegetable oils and the fear around conventionally grown produce, so non-organic fruits and vegetables. And what's missing in those conversations, I think it's two different conversations. So with vegetable oils, there's some really interesting like mechanisms to talk about because that science has shifted over 20 years, right? That's not just a selective reading of the science or cherry picking of the science. It's really just how the landscape of our understanding of vegetable oils has changed. With organic foods, or conventional foods, that is a toxicological principle that, again, we're not taught in school, which is understanding that just because a compound is present in a food that might be harmful, it doesn't mean the amount that is there is harmful. So understanding that in a traditional dose response, the graph looks kind of like an S. So it starts off right along the x-axis, and that is how much of that food, of that compound, let's say it's a pollutant, let's say it's a heavy metal, right? Let's say it's mercury. How much of that mercury can my liver detoxify? Because our livers can detoxify a little bit of mercury. It's not a whole lot, but we can handle a little bit when we're exposed. Okay, so that's the amount that my body can totally handle. My body can detoxify, and it will have no impact on my health if I'm exposed to that amount. Let's look at chronic toxicity. So we're considering how much can I be exposed to every single day for weeks to months with no adverse effects. And then we start to see, okay, now I'm getting a little bit more exposure to this. Now my health risk is starting to go up. And we set a couple of really important limits around that like curve where the limit goes up. So we set something called the no observed adverse effect level. So that is that line in between my dose response was hugging the x-axis, there was no effect, and things are starting to tick up. And then we set what's called the lowest observed adverse effect level. We for sure see your risk is starting to go up now. So we set these important like toxicological limits.
And these are established in animals, correct?
Generally, yes. So generally it's the toxicology studies are typically done in animals because there's not too many people who are like, yeah, just feed me the mercury all day, every day, slowly increase the dose and we'll see what happens, right? The detoxification processes between animals and humans are pretty similar, but one of the important things to know, so from those levels, we've got like the LD50, right? The level of exposure, which half of the animals in this case, die, right? And then you've got the maximum effect where 100% die. So you've got these other like limits that are set, understanding that dose response. From the no observed adverse effect level, regulatory agencies set a couple of, it's basically depending on whether it's a pollutant or an additive, either an acceptable daily intake level or a chronic reference dose. They mean the same thing. So they are the amount of whatever it is the compound we're talking about, mercury, pesticide residues, that you can be exposed to every single day for your entire life without it causing any appreciable health harm. They are set based on applying a safety factor to the no observed adverse effect level. So we take that, okay, we're for sure this line is flat here. This is the maximum level at which we know this line is flat. And depending on how much data we know, how much we know in humans versus animals, how steep that dose response is, if things get really messy really fast, we're going to apply a bigger safety factor. So the safety factors are typically 100 or 1,000. And what would make the difference is how rigorous the data is. So how certain are we about this no observed adverse effect level, and how certain are we that even though we measured this in mice, it applies to humans, and how quickly do things get nuts. So we set those levels, and then those are, right, there's monitoring, right? So we want to make sure that we're not exceeding those levels. When it comes to something like pesticides, so the USDA has a program called the Pesticide Data Program, very creatively named. They go out and get 10,000-ish food samples every year. And I think they have 7 states that have partner labs. They take those samples back to their labs. They prepare them as people typically would in their homes. And then they measure 300-ish pesticides and pesticide metabolites, right? To get a sense of, are there anybody breaking the rules, right? Because every pesticide has limits, often crop specific, right? So one pesticide will have a different limit for strawberries as it does for celery in terms of how much can be used in order to make sure that there's not very much left on the finished product. So typical, this is done every year, but it's typical for about 3/4 of the detections to be, 1,000 times lower than the chronic reference dose, which means it's 1,000,000 times lower than the no observed adverse effect level. The last data that I saw really broken down was from 2021, but that year 0.43% of detections were above tolerance. But that tolerance is the chronic reference dose, which already has that 1,000-fold safety factor applied from the no observed adverse effect level. So even if you were unlucky enough to get that 0.43% of foods every single day for weeks to months, you already have the safety factor built in. That's still not a dose that's probably going to cause health harm. And I think we've got all of this fear around pesticides as being toxic and problematic. What's happening right now is about 60% of Americans are afraid of pesticides in their food. What those people do, the action they take, 70-ish% of them just don't eat vegetables. 60-ish% of them just don't eat fruit. So we're actually...
Do we know whether or not they're avoiding fruits and vegetables because of this alleged fear that they have?
Yeah, so consumer surveys have shown this. So consumer surveys are not the most scientific, so we can take these numbers with a grain of salt. But yes, consumer surveys have said, okay, what is your action? Are you afraid of pesticides, yes or no? Therefore, do you? How many servings of vegetables do you eat per week? 0. How many servings of fruits do you eat per week? 0. And so the fear around pesticides, and I am all for, let's regulate the bejeepers out of these things. Let's increase the funding so we can increase the samples every year. Let's test more. Let's make sure that when a farm or a factory is not in compliance, that there's penalties for that, right? Let's make sure that we keep the food supply safe. But right now it is. Right now, the level of pesticide residues on our food are perfectly safe. The studies that have done the best job of correcting for a healthy user bias, which is a big challenge in measuring the health effects of organic foods because of the fear around pesticides being so prevalent, the people who tend to eat organic foods also tend to eat more fruits and vegetables, tend to eat more plant foods compared to animal foods, tend to be more active, tend not to smoke, tend not to drink, tend to have a higher socioeconomic status, tend to be younger, and tend to be female. It's really hard when you have so many different things impacting health outcomes to tease out, okay, so what's the effect of the actual organic foods here versus the fruits, the vegetables, the higher activity, the fact that this person probably has better healthcare because they're in a higher socioeconomic bracket. How do we tease all that out? The studies that have done the best job of controlling for that, given that it is a hard thing to control for, show no difference in health outcomes between people who eat organic foods versus conventional foods. And that's because there's so little pesticide residues on our food that a huge fraction of our conventional produce could actually qualify as organic if they wanted to go through the organic certification. It's different for different crops. So I don't remember all of the numbers, but for lettuce, it's 97%. 97% of the conventional lettuce in the store.
But do you believe that if there were really a signal of harm to be found, that we would be able to, that information would ever see the light of day? There was just an investigation revealed in, I believe it was The Telegraph. Carrie Gillam was one of the journalists who broke the story that these big ag companies, they literally fund, there's a private social network that it literally exists to suppress any dissenting voices.
Yeah, I think
voices that elicit concern around these chemicals, you know, because it's not just, I also think that it's not necessarily one chemical in question, but it's like just the accumulation, you know, the cumulative harm from all of these various exposures. You know, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on eating more, you know, nutrients, more antioxidants to help our bodies better detoxify. But what about like actually removing or mitigating some of these exposures that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I feel like it is a very important thing to be regulating the use of these chemicals because like, for example, like we know there's a risk to farm worker safety from using these chemicals. That is unequivocal.
Yeah.
So also whatever we can do for worker protections there, great idea. And if you have the means to buy organic food, I think that is a great argument for buying organic food. But I think that, so I have a history in my background's in medical research. And so I got grant funding from national granting agencies. I performed basic science research, right? I'm trying to understand this particular molecular pathway and how it works in this particular disease. I specialized in critical care medicine. And I never, ever, ever once saw in any of my colleagues doing other fields of research, nor experienced anybody tell me your research needs to look this way, or your data needs to show this, or we can't publish your paper because of this. Most scientists, there's always bad apples, right? Humans are humans, and they certainly exist everywhere. But the vast majority of scientists are in it because they love science. They love the expansion of human knowledge. They love how we ask questions and then devise experiments to collect data to answer those questions, and then how those results can show us better questions to ask for the next experiment. Like it's almost like the search for the perfect question to ask. And I don't think you can silence those voices. Like the scientists that I know, and again, I'm sure there's definitely always going to be the person who has nefarious intent.
Have you spent any time on retraction watch?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's definitely papers that get retracted.
Like 1 in 7. That's what recently there was a blog. They admitted that it was a very unsystematic review of whatever literature exists, which is sparse, obviously. I mean, it's a hard thing to study, but up to 1 in 7 papers published.
And in a particular field, or because that's definitely not the retraction. The retraction rate's under 1% for all papers. So potentially that was a stat from a specific field. It'd be interesting to know exactly.
I think it was just in general. It was it was published. I mean, they admitted that it was not a systematic, you know, that these are hard numbers to parse out, but that, I mean, the rates are pretty high.
Yeah. So the last time I looked up the rates, they were under 1%.
Trying to find it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It'd be interesting.
But go on, yeah.
Those are people who their sense of value and contributing to society is rooted in their scientific integrity. You just can't buy them all off. There's no way to suppress information like pesticides are contributing to chronic illness. There's far too many people who are doing research in those fields who would need to be paid off for that conspiracy to ever work. There would be hundreds, if not thousands, of whistleblowers. So I just don't think it's possible, having lived in science labs for such a large fraction of my life. I don't think it's possible to suppress a important finding like that.
Yeah. I think, I mean, my personal view is that people should not limit their intake of fruits and vegetables, but there is also a very reasonable cause to be skeptical and to just remain cautious, because we've been so wrong in the past, and we know the commerce tied to these products, and that suppression does exist. I mean, there's a company called Syngenta, for one, and I'm particularly interested in this company and the compound that they produce called paraquat because of its link to Parkinson's disease, which my mother had. And they've, for decades, they literally created an in-house SWAT team of scientists to suppress concerns that paraquat was actually able to enter the brain and act as a mitochondrial poison. And we know that that's fraudulent.
Yeah.
You know, in fact, Syngenta is based in China, and they produce paraquat in China. It's banned for use in China, but they sell it over here, and so we're using it over here now. I don't know. I have no idea the residues that are in the foods that it's used on, and whether or not those are contributing to Parkinson's. I don't know, but obviously there is an occupational exposure hazard, and yet that was very clearly suppressed.
Yeah. So I think we have lots of examples from history where something has been added to foods that has later been like, oh, whoops, we shouldn't have done that. I have like three points here, which first is this is why we want to fund independent scientific research, right? We want to be increasing the funding for scientists who are just out there looking to expand human knowledge to do these studies. We want to fund replication studies, right? Replication studies currently get almost no grant funding, yet they're so phenomenally important. And we want to be funding the regulatory agencies to run those science experiments as well, right? Like we want FDA labs and USDA labs to be able to also confirm those research funding, do those replication studies, and then be able to have the resources they need for regulation and enforcement. I think that's critically important. I also think that it's one of the reasons why a varied diet is so beneficial for health. So there's a bunch of studies showing that dietary diversity is probably the single most important factor in determining a healthy diet, just meaning we eat a wide variety of foods. That does a couple of things, right? One, it makes sure that we're getting a wide variety of nutrients if you're eating a wide variety of foods, but it also limits our exposure to anything that we might want to moderate, whether that's something we know really well, like added sugars or saturated fats, or if it's something that maybe has been introduced to the food supply before we find out actually, hey, that thing's not so great, maybe now we need to take it out, right? So it helps to sort of protect us from both sides, right? It stops us from overdoing any particular nutrient because nutrients do also themselves have chronic toxicity levels,
Can
right?
be overconsumed, yeah.
Yeah. So I think I would love to see increased funding for the agencies who are responsible for keeping the food supply safe.
Do you think it's smart to take a precautionary principle approach? I mean, to me, that's reasonable. Like, apparently, and this is not an area where I've spent too much time, looking into the details, but allegedly in Europe they take a more precautionary principle approach. It's one of the reasons why, there's only about 300 to 400 food additives that are approved by the EU for use there, whereas here we take a more risk management approach. There are thousands of chemicals, and we put basically the onus of, the burden of proof that these additives are safe on the food manufacturers.
So the EFSA and the FDA basically look at the same studies when they're coming up with approval versus not approval, or like sometimes you'll have a different acceptable daily intake level set in Europe versus Canada versus the USA. They're generally looking at the same research, right? They're generally looking at the same numbers. And they do, so like risk tolerance is a little bit different in Europe versus here. But there's also, chemicals that are allowed in Europe that are not allowed here. For example, they allow like 16 different food colorings, artificial food dyes, and we allow 9, I think, right? So there's a bunch that so it kind of goes both ways is what I'm trying to say. And I think, part of that is sort of, there's sort of an approach to like, how are we going to set our acceptable daily intake level? Are we going to apply a safety factor of 100 or a safety factor of 1,000? Are we going to use the lowest observed adverse effect level as our limit or the no observed adverse effect level as our limit? And that feels to me like I want to let experts decide what is the best way to approach it. But one of the big differences between Europe and America is the power of the regulatory agencies able to monitor what companies are doing. And that is not something that we have here to the same level. So we kind of have this like more unrestrained free market with food manufacture.
Here?
Yeah. And I think that has decrease the quality of our food for sure, right? Like I think that has led to a very profit motivated approach where we're going to engineer food to be as hyper palatable as possible to get the biggest possible market share, and not necessarily create food that is nutrient dense, right? And I think a lot of that could be solved again by better funding regulatory agencies. Like I will let someone else tell me if the better approach for setting an acceptable daily intake level is, the European method versus the American method. I'm comfortable with either because they both have these safety factors applied. And I think that's just like a philosophical difference where probably nobody's wrong and maybe nobody's right. But like, I think I can buy the argument each way. But I think that the bigger challenge here is we've got a system where whole fresh foods cost approximately double what their ultra processed counterparts are, and ultra processed foods are available everywhere, right? You live in the middle of nowhere, you live an hour from the closest grocery store, you can get your ultra processed foods at your local Dollar General, your Dollar Tree, your gas station. There's going to be foods there that you can get, and the whole foods cost twice as much and are much harder to get. We've got systemic issues to accessibility and affordability that need to be solved. Like, and that is way bigger than you or I can solve. But I think that is sort of like a prerequisite for helping people eat a more nutritious diet. We need to be able to get the foods into their homes affordably. And right now, we've got a system where those are right. They don't require refrigeration. There's lots of actual reasons behind why they're the most accessible, right? They don't require refrigeration. They can store nearly indefinitely. But I think it's right. It's not just about the additives. It's about the nutrients that are remaining, and it's about accessibility and affordability. Like, all of those things have to come together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I did an experiment where I went to a local 99-cent store a couple of years, 2 years ago, and I looked to see like what I could buy, on a budget, whole food wise, and it was pretty slim pickings. But I found canned fish, I found canned legumes and things like that.
What's fascinating to me is that potentially a lot of those are actually technically ultra processed foods.
Would you say they're ultra processed or just processed?
So,
because there is a difference.
Yeah, absolutely, there's a difference, and I think we need even a more nuanced, better way to tell the difference. So when we hear statistics like 58% of the calories in America come from ultra processed foods, that is using the NOVA classification. So NOVA divides all foods into 4 groups. Whole and minimally processed, so that'll be your salmon fillet, your head of broccoli, right? Processed culinary ingredients, that is your sugar, your oils, your things that you're going to add, whether at home or in the factory. Then your processed foods, so that would include things like whole wheat bread. That would include cheese it counts as a processed food. A lot of frozen vegetables, canned vegetables would count as a processed food. And then ultra processed, which includes some actually really nutrient dense foods. So it would include canned soup, frozen dinners, fruit on the bottom yogurt, instant oatmeal, the egg whites that you buy in the carton, right? Protein bars, protein powder.
Egg whites are a food they're an extract of eggs. They're not.
So the NOVA classification looks at the level of processing of the ingredients and the amount of additives. And so, for example, some cans of canned black beans would count as NOVA class 3, and then depending on the additives, some would count as NOVA class 4. So there was this really fascinating study done last year, 2023, where they were like, we've got a problem in defining ultra processed foods here. We need to address this, because if we just go ultra processed foods bad, right? We might be lumping in a lot of nutritious, healthy foods into this category. And a study that looks at the health benefits of legumes isn't going, well, which canned beans did you get, right?
Yeah.
It's just looking at, did you eat the legumes? Yes or no. So some of those might have been ultra processed, right? Canned beans. So what the study did was they had 2 panels of independent experts. One group of experts on the NOVA classification. They said, here's a bunch of foods. You tell me what NOVA class this is. and they got their list of 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. And they had this other group of experts. You're a bunch of dietitians. You tell me if this food satisfies the recommendations of the USDA dietary guidelines for Americans, right? Does this food count as a dairy serving, or as a vegetable serving, or as a protein serving? And then they looked at those 2 lists, and they had about 200 foods that were on both lists. So both in ultra-processed foods, right, those canned beans just happened to have some extra additive that pushed it into NOVA Class 4, and the dietitians were like, yeah, no, that totally counts as a legume for USDA dietary guidelines for American purposes. Then they crafted a 7-day meal plan using these foods. It was 2,000 calories per day. And it's like breakfast burrito with a flour tortilla, scrambled egg whites from the carton with margarine, cans of black beans of the NOVA Class 4 version of black beans, and some like pre-grated cheese from the bag, which would count as ultra processed instead of processed. And then we'll add a glass of orange juice and some ultra filtered milk, right? Like, I think most people would look at that meal, and sure, we might have a conversation of like things we could add to it to make it even better, but you look at that meal and go, yeah, it's solid, like, sure. So the meal's kind of like that, right? So 91% of the calories from this meal plan came from technically ultra processed foods, and yet it scored an 89 on the healthy eating index. The things that stopped it from scoring better was it overdid sodium. Canned foods tend to do that. There's ways that you could mitigate that. You could choose the low sodium options. You could rinse foods like beans to get rid of like 3/4 of the sodium by doing that. And it was insufficient in whole grains compared to what the dietary guidelines for Americans are. The average American score is 59. So we've got this whole collection of foods that are accessible, that are in your 99-cent store, that you could craft a healthy diet with. They are more affordable, and we need some kind of way of like, what like, we don't know, out of these 58% of calories that Americans are consuming that are coming from ultra-processed foods, we don't know how many of them are those foods versus, fast food and
sugar sweetened beverages,
right, and donuts and Doritos, right? Like, we don't actually have that data. We need a better way to differentiate within ultra-processed foods which ones are like making us overdo sugar and saturated fat and salt, and are contributing so few nutrients that they're causing more nutrient insufficiencies, and which ones are really great healthy options. And that's where I think Nutrivore can really fit in, because we can look at those foods and quantify the nutrient density. We can come in and say, oh, look at all of the nutrients per calorie that these foods have versus these foods. And we can add this really important data point to not just the level of processing. That's important. Like, we want to know that. But also, sometimes the processing strips out all the valuable nutrients, right? And sometimes it doesn't. And so being able to differentiate between this group that we want to moderate, not restrict, because we're moving beyond this like good or bad food, but we definitely don't want this to be the majority of our diet, versus these ones that, yeah, look, we can craft this nutrient-dense diet. They analyzed the micronutrients was within the accepted macronutrient distribution ranges for protein, carbs, and fat. It went over the recommended dietary allowance for fiber. It about doubled the dietary allowance for protein, which is way too low, so double's about perfect. And then it safely exceeded, so in that like 1 to 2, 300% of daily value range, every essential vitamin and mineral, except it fell slightly short on vitamin E, vitamin D, and choline. But the dietary guidelines for Americans already fall short on those. So that was probably not a fault of the food, right? It's probably the fault of the dietary structure needing, I think the dietary guidelines for Americans still need a little extra work, right?
Yeah. No, I love that. I think we can't get hung up on these designations like ultra processed. I think like most intuitive people, and I think it's so important. What I try to do for my audience is to cultivate an intuitive compass, so that they can better identify like, okay, not every ultra processed food is worthy of damnation. It's sort of like the term. It's sort of like I've likened it many times in the past to the BMI. Yeah. Which is a fantastic screening tool, but a completely imperfect diagnostic tool.
I mean, it was
developed. You have to look at the person. Like, I might be obese or at least overweight. It was developed to
measure populations, not measure the individual.
Right.
It was developed to say this group of people on average. It was supposed to be a scientific tool. It was never supposed to be used to be fat shamed in the doctor's office.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, from personal experience, that's how it goes.
Yeah, you got to like look at body composition It's very interesting.
But also look at, I mean, now we're sort of getting into like health at any size type conversation, but look at how the person's eating, how are they sleeping, how active they are. So I used to be obese, and I can't tell you how many times I went to the doctor because I had chronic migraines, and I got told, you just need to lose weight.
Wow.
It is a really rough experience, and not one that helps anybody change their habits. And I think that it's another reason why I kind of want to shift this conversation from foods to restrict to foods to add, right? From demonizing foods and having yes foods and no foods and working on long-term healthy habits, but also from this very like weight loss centered diet mentality to one that's focused on health, right? Because if I have to choose between being thin and being healthy, it's granted, maybe not everyone's going to choose the same, but my choice is going to be health. I care a lot, especially as I enter a certain age range. I care a lot about like my risk of osteoporosis, my risk of Alzheimer's, my risk of cardiovascular disease, of cancer. Like I care a lot about the quality of life that I will have as I age. Those things are more important to me, but it just so happens that for most people, the healthy habits that are going to help reduce their risk of long-term health problems are also going to help, normalize their body size to a metabolically healthy body. So if we can just change that conversation towards, this is sustainable nutrition. These are important healthy habits, and it doesn't have to be high intensity interval training if that's not what you like. It can be a hike in the woods, right? That's my favorite way to start my day. It can be a walk around the block, right? It can be accessible. It can be taking that first little baby step towards building a really important lifelong habit. And I think when we do that, we lower the barrier to entry. Because one of the things that food fear does, and I know you've seen this in the wellness community, right? This like moving of the goalpost. So it's like, okay, here's all the things that you need to do to be healthy. Oh wait, you're doing all those things. Here's all the things you need to do to be healthy. Oh wait, you're doing all those things. Let me raise the goalpost even higher. Here's all of the things that you need to do to be healthy. And what that has effectively done, like the people who are afraid of pesticides in their food so they don't eat fruits or vegetables, is it's made people not want to try. The majority of people out there feel like a healthy diet is not something they have access to. If they feel like it's too hard, it's too expensive, they can't buy those expensive foods, or they don't even have access to those foods, they don't have time to prepare those foods, so why even try? Why even bother? So the whole conversation needs to change to, okay, but how about just grabbing a piece of fruit instead of a snack from the vending machine? How about adding a salad to our, order through the drive-thru, right? Let's not take the tomato off of our burger, right? Like, how about these small little things that in the end can start building that healthy habit that helps build the next one, that helps build the next one. But even that one little, that difference between 0 servings of vegetables per day and 1 serving of vegetable per day, that lowers all-cause mortality risk the same as going from 1 serving of vegetables to 4. So that first little baby step that we did of figuring out, like, how can we add just 1 cup of your favorite vegetable per day, that one little difference that suddenly feels like, oh yeah, I can do that. I can figure out how to, have some carrot sticks with my lunch. Like, sure, yeah, I can do this one little thing. Oh, it doesn't have to be organic. Oh, cool, right? It can be the canned green beans. That's amazing. Okay, yeah, I can definitely do that. I have access to that. Suddenly we're like moving forward in a way that could dramatically reduce the risks of cardiovascular disease, right? The number one cause of morbidity and mortality in the USA. Type 2 diabetes. We could be normalizing people's, weight and improving their metabolic health. We can be reducing risk of Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis. Like, all of that follows from making healthy eating accessible and affordable for people. And that requires both like focusing on nutrients and where we're going to get that, and maybe how we're going to get that within these affordable ultra-processed foods, but also like taking the shame and the blame out of food choices. So we're going away from this like Mount Everest feeling thing of eating a healthy diet to, oh yeah, I could do that. Oh wait, that's all I have to do? That's so easy. Sure, I can do that, right? And I think that's the way we change the world, right? That's the way we reverse the epidemics of chronic disease, is making it as easy as possible, lowering the barrier to entry, ideally removing the barrier, no barriers to entry, right? Anybody can do this.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's so true that within the wellness world, I feel like I don't really follow that many people that do perpetuate this whole like that hierarchy model that you alluded to, but it exists.
I have purposely unfollowed many of those people.
Yeah. No, I think you got to meet people where they're at.
Yes.
But it's also important to acknowledge that not everybody is approaching, wellness from the same baseline. Like people are, some people want to make their whole thing, and are really passionate about making, little tweaks to optimize.
Which is fantastic, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I've built Nutrivore the way that I have, because I can meet people wherever they are. So that person who's getting most of their meals from the drive-thru right now, I've got some action steps for that person. That elite athlete who's looking to, tweak so that they can improve their performance, that like 1% that can make the difference between, qualifying for the Olympics, right? I've got something for that person too, and every person in between. And I think it's because all of us can benefit from a basic nutritional sciences knowledge, right? Just a basic understanding of what nutrients do in the body, what types of foods have what types of nutrients, how much of those nutrients we need, how much of those foods support our health in what ways, right? What nutrients can I focus on if I have XYZ health issue, right? That might mitigate that the symptoms I'm feeling, might slow disease progression, right? Or might reduce my risks in the future, right? All of us can benefit from that knowledge. And I think when we all have the level of nutrition knowledge that the average high schooler has of algebra or grammar, when we all have that nutrition knowledge, it not only informs our day-to-day choices, right? It's not only like the base information that we have when we're at the grocery store and we go, oh wait, there's no, vegetables in my cart. Let me go back to the produce section. Let me go to the freezer aisle and see what's on sale today, right? It's useful for that, right? It's useful for giving me what I need to make better choices in the grocery store, better choices at a restaurant or the drive-thru or wherever I am getting food. But it also protects me from that very destructive psychology of the restrictive mindset, because I have a knowledge base that can tell me, no, I don't need, those aren't bad foods, right? This is misinformation. This diet that's telling me to be afraid of legumes, that's not correct. I know how great legumes are because they're the best food source of folate. Yeah. The fourth most common nutrient deficiency, right? Or nutrient insufficiency.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what was the fourth?
Yeah, the fourth is folate.
Wow.
So it's 90-ish% of Americans don't get enough folate.
It's really clear that you come at this with a certain point of view, which I think is very valuable and probably a point of view shared by many people. So I appreciate it very much. And so, I also really appreciate your willingness to, to pivot when new data has presented itself as it has.
So it's a really crummy feeling to realize that you were wrong about something. And it's hard to admit that you're wrong. It's hard to admit you're wrong to your spouse, let alone a million people online. But I also think that it's what our entire, right? Like if you just think about health conscious communities, right? People who care about health and care about helping other people get healthy. We've taken a wrong turn somewhere, like as an entire community. And we've really kind of followed this like fear-based mindset, I think way too far. And I think that part of steering this entire ship and sort of turning it around is modeling how to admit when you're wrong, how to change perspective publicly, how to show the viability of business on the other side of fear-based marketing, right? Like that, hey guys, it actually is okay over here, I promise. And I also think that helps people, right? Because so many of us, I think there's more incorrect information about nutrition on the internet than there is correct information. Maybe by like 100 times. Like haven't counted, but I feel
certainly
like it's
on TikTok there was a big
number. Oh yes.
Something was published recently. It was like 90%
of
nutrition information on TikTok is like erroneous.
Yeah, that feels like my FYP for sure. And so I think that because everyone has heard incorrect information about nutrition, and it is so hard for everyone to go, ooh, I was wrong. Let me take an action with because I have new information. Holy smokes, is that ever hard? Is that ever hard to like see new information, be open to it, be open to changing your mind about something, and then take an action as a result? Like, that is many steps that are really hard. And I think one of the things that I can do, in addition to creating this nutritional sciences education for the average person, in addition to creating resources to help people eat a healthier diet without engaging in diet mentality or restriction, so that they're achieving sustainable nutrition, in addition to all of that, I can show how to be open to new information, how to change our minds about something when we're given new good quality data, and how to take action on that. And I think modeling that and showing that is as important as the education that I'm creating.
I love it. Let's talk about vegetable oils.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we're probably going to diverge in terms of our opinions in certain places, but hopefully we'll be able to find common ground.
Yeah.
But this is a topic that you've been talking a lot about on social media, and I did read, I would say most, if not all, of your
the 12,000 word article,
massive blog that you posted on your website. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. So vegetable oils are something that I used to think were inflammatory. So part of my scientific rigor that I'm bringing to the conversation now comes from, this is one thing that I have to admit that I got wrong in the past. So I have to correct the record on that, put out the correct information, and show people what is the science that I have looked at that has changed my perspective on this. And I think with vegetable oils as a, inflammatory food, as a industrial toxic seed oils and all of the words that we use to describe them, I think the reason why these myths are so pervasive and so deep is because we've got, again, from like 20 years ago, really good science saying that, hey, yeah, maybe these are a problem, right? So we've got this like scientific, it's not just a seed of truth, right? Like, the science looked really different 20 years ago on seed oils. It looked like, too much linoleic acid could potentially be a problem. So what I think is really important is, as we follow the science and we look at the modern science, is to review our opinions. So the seed of truth with vegetable oils being inflammatory is this chemical pathway where linoleic acid is converted by a couple of enzymes in the body into a different omega-6 called arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid lives in our cell membranes, and it is metabolized by the cell into a variety of signaling molecules, thromboxanes, eicosanoids. They are signaling molecules that tend to turn on inflammation, right? That they're used to ramp up the immune system. And so the fear is, okay, linoleic acid turns into arachidonic acid turns into inflammatory signaling molecules, that turns on inflammation, and inflammation is part of the pathogenesis of every chronic disease. So therefore, linoleic acid, or at least too much of it, must be bad. What's really fascinating is that there's this alternate pathway. So linoleic acid can also become a different, still an omega-6, called dihomogamma-linolenic acid, DGLA, which is a potently anti-inflammatory fat. And what controls the pathway from linoleic acid to either arachidonic acid or DGLA is there's a little bit of genetic variation here. And I think it's too early in this research to say whether or not there is a group of people who do have inflammatory responses to linoleic acid. It may be true that there is, right, like the ApoE4 gene variant increasing the risk factors with high saturated fat diets. There may be a sort of like analogous genetic variant here with linoleic acid. Right now, I think this field of science is too early to say for sure. But one of the main things that's controlling whether or not linoleic acid becomes arachidonic acid or DGLA, right, the one that might potentially increase inflammation versus the one that's going to decrease inflammation, is the presence of a variety of other nutrients. Zinc is so important that serum DGLA can be used as a marker of zinc deficiency, and omega-3s. So the presence of omega-3s can also push linoleic acid towards this anti-inflammatory metabolic pathway. And so when you give linoleic acid in vegetable oil form to humans, we overall see a neutral or slightly anti-inflammatory effect. Then linoleic acid has these other ways that it interferes with cholesterol metabolism to help lower LDL cholesterol, and we see in large population studies as well as intervention trials, so much so that we have these big systematic reviews and meta-analyses showing overall linoleic acid reduces cardiovascular disease risk, reduces cardiovascular disease mortality, reduces risk of type 2 diabetes, doesn't in fact impact cancer risk, absolutely, but does lower cancer mortality slightly. It's not a huge effect, and reduces all-cause mortality. In the grand scheme of things, a minor reduction in those things compared to other dietary patterns, right? Far more important to eat your vegetables and get some seafood, right? Eat some nuts and seeds and some legumes. But the science, right? We've got these quite a large collection, right? 40 or so intervention trials from the last 10, 15 years now showing that when you give people linoleic acid, they have improved health outcomes. I think it has become now an unequivocal body of scientific literature.
The observational research to me, though, is heavily confounded. So personally, I find it hard to put much stock in those because some extremely healthy foods are rich in linoleic acid, nuts and seeds. Mm-hmm. And there's also the healthy user bias that accompanies the consumption of these grain and seed oils. Like they're literally, you can go to the supermarket right now and most, if not all of them, are adorned with the red heart check logo from the American Heart Association. Yeah. We've been told for decades that these are the oils to prioritize compared to...
Because it's been known since the 50s that they lower LDL cholesterol.
They do, yeah. They increase availability of the LDL receptor. And so they're often compared to saturated fat. And so the question is like, how are they compared to extra virgin olive oil? How are they compared to not using a lot of added fat in the diet?
Yeah. So studies that have compared different vegetable oils have different effects, I think is the big thing.
Yes.
So most of them are, if you swap out, so they're always looking at swapping out butter or margarine. So swapping out your saturated fat for your polyunsaturated fat. So if you swap out butter or margarine, you get, for like each tablespoon you swap out, you get something like a 1% reduction in all-cause mortality with something like corn oil, something like a 2% reduction in something like canola oil, and something like a 4% reduction with olive oil, right?
These are tiny like hazard ratios.
For each tablespoon, right?
Yeah.
So if you're swapping out a quarter cup, you're going to get now 12% or 16%. But yeah, I mean, that is another thing. That's why I said, like, in the grand scheme of things, swapping out, right, the highest linoleic acid consumers, right, the people who consume the most vegetable oil compared to other fats, see a 10, 11%, 12% reduction in all-cause mortality. 3 servings of vegetables per day can get you a 25% reduction in all-cause mortality. So in the grand scheme of diet factors, I don't think vegetable oils are that important, but they also still show a reduction, right? Not an increase. So I think, still from a busting the myth perspective, telling us that we need to be afraid of this, we need to read every food label, because if we see canola oil, that's a terrible food and we need to put that back on the grocery store shelf. That's not what the science shows.
Well, there's it's a bit of sometimes there's a false dichotomy that's made where, like, I agree with you that they're not, like, if you take an ultra processed junk food,
right,
like something that's like abject junk, and you take out the soybean oil and you add butter or whatever, even avocado oil, yeah, or something like that, that's not going to magically turn it into a health food,
Correct. Yeah.
And I think that a lot of claims are made about these, grain and seed oils on social media that are unfounded. I concede that there's no strong evidence there's no evidence that they're acutely inflammatory, although when taken out of the fryer at a local restaurant,
sure, yes,
that's not something that you want to consume.
You certainly, all oils have this problem. This is not unique to vegetable oils, but deep frying, keeping those oils at such a high temperature, especially when you use the same oil over and over and over again, yeah, that does oxidize over time.
But they're particularly high the cooking oils that are predominated by polyunsaturated fats are particularly prone.
They are going to oxidize more quickly in that deep fryer environment where you're using the same fat. So there actually is like regulations for restaurants for how often different types of oils have to be cycled.
They're not followed.
But again, this brings me back to let's have resources for the inspections and making sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can smell it. You can smell it when you come up to a restaurant that's got old oil in their fryers. Yeah. It has a really distinctive.
I think it's a good smell.
Oh, I think it's very off-putting. I think the stale oil smell to me, there's something about I don't know if it's the heterocyclic amines. Like, I don't know what it is that smell is very off-putting. I think, like deep fried food, I think is great, but there's something about that, like, oh, that's old oil smell. And maybe my very first part-time job when I was 16 was in a fish and chips restaurant, and I worked the fryers. So maybe that's some kind of deep programming from that.
Somebody once told me that the taste that we associate with deep fried foods that makes deep fried foods so delicious is actually the rancidity of those oils. I don't know.
Oh.
It's an anecdote. Somebody once told me that, and I just,
I mean, there's a really fascinating like psychology of flavor preference where it has to do with like flavor, like associations, right? So we have like positive associative learning drives our flavor preferences. So I suppose if you were consuming your fries cooked in rancid oil as a kid, and that was a really fun outing with your family, that you remember like how excited you were to go to the drive-thru or go to whatever fast food restaurant.
Well, it's like think of how delicious the char on meat is, but we know that the char on meat is the least healthy portion of that.
Sure,
steak,
Maillard reaction. Yes.
Yeah.
But also, and this is where like diversity of diets comes back into play, because we can reduce the production of polyaromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines, like these two classes of carcinogenic, tasty browning products. We can reduce the production of those when we use herbs and spices, right, full of antioxidants. And we can also counteract a lot of their effects in our body with the phytonutrients in cruciferous vegetables. So having some, Brussels sprouts with our charred steak, still medium rare, charred steak, the most delicious kind, that can actually completely negate these are compounds that have a pretty small increase in cancer risk. And probably when you start looking at those compounds in the context of a healthy diet, I imagine that risk starts to disappear into statistical insignificance.
What about the concern around lipid peroxidation? I mean, these oils are particularly prone to oxidation in the lipid bilayer, and in the context of widespread, vitamin E deficiency, doesn't that make it even more worrisome? So
the initial studies that compared the oxidation capacity of lipid peroxidation specifically, when a person consumed linoleic acid, compared it to oleic acid, so the main heart healthy fat in olive oil and avocado oil, and went, holy smokes, lipid peroxidation capacity way higher in linoleic acid, so way higher in the vegetable oil group compared to the olive oil group. Yikes, scary. The studies that have come through since that have said, okay, well, now let's actually add a few more fat types to this. Let's look at saturated fat too. Let's look at omega-3s in addition to omega-6s, have shown that the lipid peroxidation capacity of linoleic acid is actually the same as saturated fats or omega-3s. And it's not that linoleic acid is uniquely harmful, but rather that oleic acid is uniquely beneficial. So again, I still think we put olive oil as the king of oils. Canola oil actually has a kind of a unique composition that I would say maybe can share the podium with olive oil. Canola oil is up to 66% oleic acid, so it's actually a dominant monounsaturated fat oil, only 20% linoleic acid, and then 7 to 15% alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3. So it kind of has it's a hard one to compare to something like sunflower seed oil, which is almost entirely linoleic acid, right? So it's got a really interesting fatty acid profile, and studies that have pitted canola oil against olive oil generally show they have pretty equal effects on cardiovascular disease risk and maybe work through slightly different pathways. So it may be better to actually incorporate both. So I think canola oil can kind of be separated out from other vegetable oils just because its composition is quite quite different.
But you're missing out on the anti-inflammatory polyphenols that you get with extra virgin olive oil, like the oleocanthal.
Sure. And triterpenes, which I feel like the triterpenes are fascinating. We've got all this entire class of triterpenes that are named after like the Latin name of olives, which is, I'm going to Olicaceae or something like that. I don't know if I'm probably butchering that terribly. We've got this whole class of triterpenes that the reason why they're named after olives is because they were first discovered in olives, and they're predominantly found in olives. And they're also potentially one of the mechanisms behind the health benefits of, yes, especially a good quality extra virgin olive oil, which can have up to 50 times more vitamin E than refined olive oil. So yeah, like also the unrefined or like the cold pressed version of vegetable oils also will have more vitamin E, more polyphenols, more carotenoids. That's also why those oils tend to have like lower smoke points and shorter shelf lives, because all of those things can increase the chain reaction that is sort of rancidity. But yeah, I mean, you can get also a higher vitamin E version of that typically would be called rapeseed oil, not canola oil at that point. Or a higher version of, you can get like pretty bougie cold pressed corn oil cold pressed sunflower oil.
You can keep those,
yeah,
Sarah.
But they do also, kind of the way comparing an extra virgin olive oil to a refined olive oil, they do have higher nutritive value, usually higher phytosterols and higher vitamin E, higher polyphenols.
That's good to know. But don't they still undergo, regardless of whether or not they're cold pressed, they undergo the refining, the bleaching, the deodorization?
Oh, no. So if they're, so the cold pressed versions are also typically organic. So you can't use solvents in organic processes. So if that's something that's really important, that's there. But to talk a little bit about like the solvent extract, like the bottle that just says vegetable oil and doesn't actually tell you what it is, like in the grocery store, that's like 99 cents for the giant jug, right? So like this super cheap vegetable oil in that process. So hexane is the most typical solvent used to help separate out the oil from the fibrous material. The next step is a gentle heating step, so far below what we need to worry about oxidation, like far below the smoke point, and that evaporates the hexane. So studies that measure the hexane left in vegetable oils, actually, I think the study was a 2011 study. So I did the math using the highest hexane detected in any of those oils, and the highest hexane was actually detected in an olive oil, which in that case it's a pollutant, because that's not a normal process for olive oil. Right.
Yeah, they just press olives.
Yeah.
Well, with extra virgin olive oil, they just press olives. So
they just press. Potentially it was a refined. I'd have to go back and look at the study,
like a light
and see,
olive oil
maybe,
or something.
Or maybe mostly olive oil, and it's cut with some other vegetable oils. But most oils have none detected hexane in the finished product. And the ones that do, if you use the highest hexane detectable and you do the math, in order to hit the chronic reference dose, which again, reminder, has a safety factor applied lower than the no observed adverse effect level. In order to hit the chronic reference dose of hexane, you have to consume 11 liters of vegetable oil every single day.
Oof.
Which is 97,000 calories worth of vegetable oil.
Yeah.
My other fun fact. So the fact is, yes, hexane is a solvent, and it's used in the industrial extraction of vegetable oils. It's also used in the production of collagen peptides. So we have this health halo around collagen peptides, and yet we're terrified of the hexane in vegetable oil. I've never seen a study that's measured whether or not there's trace hexane detectable at the end of collagen peptides. I doubt it. I would imagine it's like vegetable oils, that most of them have none detected at the end, and if there is any, it's so minute it's not going to cause any health harm. So I'm not trying to like diss collagen peptides. I think collagen peptides are great, but rather to use that as an example of like where the narrative is used to spread fear about one food, and then it's like completely ignored when we're like selling our collagen supplements.
Yeah, that's never been a concern for me, because I trust that it's extracted from, these oils post-production.
So the other thing that happens, so the next thing is a high heat step. So that's done under vacuum. So there's no oxygen. So if there's no oxygen, you can't oxidize. And then the bleaching is done with bleaching clay. So it's not done with chemicals. It's done, bleaching clay is, it's a perfectly natural process. So the clay actually holds on to things like, what's taken out is things like chlorophyll and carotenoids. any heterocyclic amines that might have been produced in that initial heating step. So all of those things are removed. That makes the oil a lighter color. It makes it more neutral flavor. But also, really importantly, all of those compounds can increase the chain reaction that is rancidity. So it actually makes it a more shelf-stable oil. And then very importantly, the initial lipid peroxidation has to be measured for oils. That is part of the quality control for every batch of oils. And I can't remember what I think it's 0.5%, I think is the maximum allowed, but I'm not sure, I may not be remembering that correctly, but it's a very, very low level. So the other thing is, the oil that makes it onto your shelf also has a starting value of incredibly low oxidation. And the reason why that's important is the more oxidized it is to start, the faster it will go rancid. So that's, if you remember the problem with fish oils from a few years ago, where so many of them were super rancid. And it was especially problematic for cod liver oil. This became big talking point in the wellness community. It was because the starting point of the oil was too high of a lipid peroxidation measure, so it would go rancid faster in storage. So by the time it got to the consumer, it was is it supposed to taste like this, right? So that's a really that's an important quality control thing that's happening with vegetable oil manufacturers. So so I look at all of those processes. I'm that's mechanical filtration when you're using bleaching clay. That is, the hexane is completely evaporated, or 99.99999% evaporated. There's so little left. I'm not worried about that. I'm not coming close to 97,000 calories of vegetable oil per day. And the end result is something with such low lipid peroxidation to start with that it has a really great shelf life and a really high smoke point. This is great. To me, I feel reassured by that process.
Well, it's certainly reassuring. They also have I know a small but significant amount of trans fats that are generated as part of that process, right? The deodorization step.
Yes. So I think regulation is 0.5%, I think, of trans fats. Yes. There's a small amount of trans fats that can be produced in lots of things. Whether or not that is of health concern,
depends how much you're consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on the quality of the whole diet. So, yep.
Yeah, I'm still...
You're not going to go out and buy canola oil just yet.
No. I don't freak out when it makes its way into my diet in the restaurant setting, even though I know that's probably actually the time in which I should be the most concerned, because I don't know how it's been handled in that kitchen.
Yeah, I think canola oil is not a normal choice for deep fryers.
It's too expensive, probably.
Yeah, and that omega-3s flavor people tend not to like because it can have kind of a fishy flavor.
Interesting.
So it's more likely something like peanut oil, corn oil, soybean oil. So I think that's probably overall, that's a kind of that's probably a good thing for canola oil's sake.
Yeah.
If canola oil is being used to roast your vegetables, it's literally just being it's being poured into the pan and then your vegetables are going in, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think you need to worry about that repeated high heat frying that can oxidize fats in a deep fryer when you're in a restaurant. Even if it is the peanut oil or whatever it is, and it's been used too many times and that is heavily oxidized, whether or not that is a problem for you health-wise completely depends on what the composition of your entire diet looks like. How often are you eating that food? What are your other risk factors, right? Once in a while, having French fries that were cooked in the worst overused oil is still not going to be a health issue. It's if you're eating that every single day.
Yeah.
Right?
I agree. I think that's a reasonable take.
Yeah.
I think that's totally reasonable. My concern is the chronic consumption over the long term on brain health, on other tissues and other organs in the body, where there is generally a paucity of evidence, and I feel like until the evidence is irrefutable, I think it's reasonable to continue to question it. And what I think frustrates me sometimes is, particularly on social media, and social media is not necessarily reflective of the real world or the scientific establishment, is that sometimes it feels like, I know for my listeners have told me they feel like they can't even question it. And I feel like if you feel like you can't question something, that's probably what you should be questioning the most.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the challenges that we have in how nutrition is communicated on social media is it's very black and white. And look, we are incredibly biologically complex. Most things have some kind of happy medium, which is kind of the opposite of black and white. Like black and white is all good or all bad, but actually for most things we want to be in a range. And that's true for, potential exposures to contaminants or additives or preservatives or any of those compounds. That's also true for nutrients, right? Like there's an amount that is beneficial or an amount that's okay, and then there's an amount that's too much, right? And I think that the challenge on social media is like a bit just the polarization, right? I go to my camp, you go to your camp, and I only talk to people who are in my camp, right? Like that, we see that not just in the wellness community, like that is just what social media is these days.
I do my best to reach across the divide, though.
Yes. Yeah.
And
have a conversation.
Yeah, but it's not, that effort is not always appreciated. And I still see that a lot of the times people from the so-called evidence-based, community are like, just, shut up and drink your seed oils, like, and I think that's frustrating. It's gaslighting because people are not well.
I will say, it's one of the reasons why I try to frame all of my information not just positively, like let's focus on the health benefits of foods to add, right? Like I try to frame everything in terms of like appreciating the nutritive value and health benefits of any food that has nutritive value or health benefits, but also why I come at topics like vegetable oil, right? Terribly polarizing issue, right? People have very big feelings about vegetable oil. I come at that with compassion and understanding. Look, I used to believe this too. I have been in restaurants where I have asked them to use olive oil to cook my food instead of whatever they were going to use instead.
Well, I would still prefer that they do that.
Yes. I mean, again, I think olive oil does get to be king of healthy fats for sure, along with maybe seafood, right? Maybe canola oil. But I think that, what I try to do is come at these conversations with facts, but also compassion and understanding. And yes, it can be very frustrating if you heard from one person that this is the root cause of all of your health problems. And then you come over to my content and you see me saying, actually, don't be afraid. This is beneficial. That's not necessarily going to be enough for you to let go of your fear, right? Like, that's why there's a 12,000 word article with 86 I think citations on my site.
Very impressive.
It was months in the works. And I will have another one about another topic in another 6 months probably. That seems to be my time frame. But it's one of the reasons why I take that level of rigor to these topics. But also I try to communicate it with like, look, I understand this is confusing. I understand not wanting to believe it because I don't want my efforts of the past or the extra money that I spent in the past to have not been like for a good reason, right? I don't want this person that I learned it from that I think is amazing, that I have a parasocial relationship with. I don't want to think that they misled me. And they probably didn't. I mean, I think most misinformation is not nefarious in nutrition. I think as someone who totally believed the things that I was wrong about in the past, like I meant well, like I thought I was doing good. So I definitely don't think, you'll see people with narratives about how the entire wellness community is all grifters, right? And I don't believe that. But it's why I also try to communicate within sort of like a non-judgmental safe space. It's why the Nutrivore motto is nourishment, not judgment, because we want to, I want to create a safe space to come learn. And that means that you can come and ask me questions. Well, what about the bleaching, right? What about the hexane? And I will answer that question. I will always answer those questions with, I feel there's no dumb question, right? They used to say, when I was in university, they would say, the only dumb question is the one not asked, right? So being that safe space to if you've seen something, ask me about it. And if I don't know the answer, I will also say I don't know. Right? I will try to go find out for you, but maybe that's beyond my level of expertise, and I will also tell you that. And I think that is, as a part of, creating an ecosystem where we can change the narrative from diet culture mindset to a accessible, affordable approach to still improving diet quality. Part of the accessible and affordable part is busting myths, but part of like that permissive structure is creating a space where people feel like it's okay to learn and it's okay to change their opinions on things. And I understand it's hard. It creates a lot of messy, big feelings. And it can feel safer to kind of retreat to our little confirmation bias bubbles of safety. But I think you're right. There are some evidence-based content creators out there that do so with a level of aggression and judgment and attack that I personally, having been on the receiving end, don't appreciate. I don't think it helps a conversation, and I don't think it helps do what isn't the goal to get more people to engage with that information and read that information and maybe change their minds and maybe then share that with their audiences and bring their audiences over to, understanding the value of a food. So if that is the goal, then attacking that person for, let's say they are wrong, right? But attacking them for being wrong is not going to help open up a conversation where that person is like, yeah, show me your data. So yeah, there's definitely some
there
jerks.
Are plenty of grifters that have credentials after their names on social media that espouse a sort of shield of being evidence-based. But I think you can't. Science is not religious truth. It's a process. It's a method of asking questions, of investigation, and I think part of how science is asking questions. And the minute you're fed something that you're supposed to swallow as a dogmatic truth, particularly when we've been wrong in the past, and also especially when there's so much money tied to these kinds of products, I think it is very reasonable today to maintain a degree of skepticism. And
but I would say skepticism,
like fear is not the answer.
No, but I do think a healthy dose of skepticism is a wise course for all navigating of life. But I think that, so for me, it's always like, what's the sales pitch, right? So when you see that fear-based, right, be afraid of this food, it almost always comes with, and buy my, right? And that for me, I mean, look, we all have to make a living, right? We all are selling something, but I'm not going to sell you something on the basis of you being afraid of something else, right? I'm going to sell you something based on its merits, not based on how this other thing is terrible. And I think that is like, that to me is like the number one, and we certainly get this on both sides, right, of the evidence-based divide. I think because there's a lot of people who claim to be evidence-based who aren't, right? And I think that to me, that's like the number one. It's not a guarantee, right? It's not a guarantee that supplement's not great.
For many in the evidence-based community, the whole like calling people out, myth busting is a grift in and of itself to sell their courses.
Oh,
so it's very much, it's like two sides of the same coin, but that being said, I will call out my own, the wellness world, and there is a lot of bullshit that's being, peddled within the wellness community as well.
And I think, again, like we're all here to make a living, but I think
and help people. And
I think that there's a way to do that with integrity, and not everybody is following that path.
Yes. Well, anything else you want to add? So fun.
Oh my gosh.
So great getting to hang with you.
This feels like it took 6 minutes.
Well, I don't have anything. My schedule is open. So if there's anything else you want to cover. I just think it's like, it's so great when people with integrity and even divergent viewpoints, can express where they've pivoted. There are certain things that I've, believed to be true that I've had to change my mind about publicly. Dairy, I think, is an amazing food.
Oh yeah, tell me how that transition happened.
I don't know. Granted, this was just like it was like a blip on the radar of my own personal, wellness journey. But there was a point where I kind of swallowed a lot of the dogma about like dairy is inflammatory. It's inherently inflammatory. Right. It's like dirty, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And now it's like, it's a huge part of my diet. Like I love it. I think it's great.
I had convinced myself that dairy was causing my migraines for 10 years.
Wow.
It turns out, no, that wasn't it. It was just barometric pressure drops combined with stress. Like if I'm stressed and the barometric pressure drops, those things happen together. Yep, that causes a migraine. Dairy had nothing to do with it. But I was certain for 10 years.
10 years. Wow.
That I avoided dairy and unnecessarily. And dairy's got some really cool things in it, right?
Yeah, dairy's
conjugated
great.
Linoleic acid. What a cool natural trans fat.
Are you familiar with pentadecanoic
C15?
Yes. A lot of people are talking about this.
Natural source is dairy.
Well, what's your unbiased take? Because I actually had the founder of a company that creates a product, like a C15 product, on the show, but it was not a paid. Like oftentimes the podcasters, get like these paid founder interviews. Sure. I deliberately, like, there was no.
You're like, I want to ask you all my real questions.
Exchanged because I wanted an unbiased, because I'm skeptical. Like, there's a new essential fatty acid dropped. Like, what's the deal with that?
And why is it an odd number?
Yeah.
Most fatty acids have an even number of carbons. That's kind of interesting.
Very.
So I only recently had a chance to do like a quick look at the scientific literature. And I will say the observational studies that basically show like the higher C15 in diets as basically a marker of dairy intake, and showing that is correlated with better health outcomes is very interesting. The intervention trials that have been done so far have been very small and kind of underwhelming. So for me, like I do not see enough evidence to recommend this as a supplement, but maybe a great explanation for the health effect of like another additional great explanation for the health benefits of dairy.
Seen from like the consumption of full fat dairy.
Yeah. Which I mean, yes, because then you also have your conjugated linoleic acid. You also have butyric acid, right? Like there's other great things, and this is probably yet another great thing that we're getting from dairy. But I don't think there's enough like strong data yet to be able to say, like, there's no systematic reviews yet, right? That's the studies that have been done where they've given people C15 supplements have been very small.
There's like 2
very short
trials.
Yeah,
right?
and that with like 26 people, 12 of which got a placebo, right? Like they're very small. That is not convincing enough to me to recommend a supplement at this point. I mean, I'm always open to seeing more studies and seeing more data and changing my mind.
I think they claim that if you don't regularly consume dairy, you might see a benefit. I don't think there's data to back that, but it's like if you're consuming dairy, I don't think it's something that you have to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was one study I saw where they actually measured people's tissue levels. It was tissue levels or blood levels. I can't. I'm not sure now. It seems like potentially we can, and this is like the thing that we need to know, right? Can we make this, right? Can we make it from something else? Because when you're measuring tissue levels, is that just a straight indicator of dairy intake, or is that an indicator of some other processes? I think this is one of the challenges in nutritional sciences, right? This has happened for the last 200 years of nutritional science history, of people seeing a little preliminary data and getting very excited and then shouting their ideas to everyone. I mean, this literally happened before minerals were identified as an essential nutrient, which was 100 years before vitamins were identified as an essential nutrient. Also 100 years before the Krebs cycle was figured out. There was this politician who was like, yo, we shouldn't eat carbs. Your bread's terrible. You should only eat what I eat, just like meat and vegetables. That is like he's considered like the father of the low carb diet, Brillat-Savarin. Like it's.
Wait, who was it? Was a president?
He was a politician.
A politician.
Yeah, in France.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so he like, I mean, he wasn't even like one of the scientists, but like even scientists would do this, right? So like, there's lots of charismatic, very cool scientists back then, right? Because you kind of had to be like a lord. You had to be like rich already to get a science background to become a scientist. So it was like a really cool like profession to have in the 1800s, early 1900s, right? And yeah, so like there were even scientists who'd be like, aha, I have discovered this one thing. This one thing must be the most important thing. And so for the entire history of nutritional sciences, charismatic people have made assumptions based on preliminary data. Or how many times have the various dietary guidelines preceded the science to underpin them?
Hello, Ansel Keys.
Oh, yeah. Yes, exactly. And that, influenced dietary guidelines for 30 years, right? Before that, the Basic 7, which came out in 1917, not sure now, butter was its whole own food group because it was high in vitamin A, and they only knew about a few vitamins at this point. They had a food group that was like cabbage and oranges and tomatoes. Like it was just like this random food group. It was like the vitamin C foods. I mean, it was a great attempt at putting together a healthy diet based on, we still don't know about all the vitamins yet. we don't know about all the minerals yet, right? Like so many times, either, somebody has like spread, some kind of miracle cure related. So the first mineral to be identified as essential was iodine. And it was this one guy who was like, oh, iodine's an interesting brand new element, brand new discovered during the chemical revolution. And look, there's iodine in sea sponges. And also there's this thing that people take for goiters called the Coventry remedy, and its secret ingredient is burned sea sponge. I wonder if it's iodine. So he made an iodine tincture, right? Just dissolved some iodine crystals in alcohol and gave it to people with goiters, and their goiters disappeared in a few weeks. Very, very cool. So then everybody wanted iodine tinctures for everything. And it caused this huge bunch of people to get iodine toxicity because it was way too much iodine, which then causes like hyperthyroidism. It causes heart palpitations and dizziness and all these negative effects. And then people were like, I don't feel good when I take this iodine. I'll stop, right? We've got this like huge history, this 230 year history of this preliminary data. Cool, I can shrink goiters with my iodine tincture. Therefore, we need to all, this is the like the magic cure, right? Is just taking iodine will cure all of your things. They used to think that radium would give you a internal glow.
Whoa.
We've got this history, 230 years of... That
sounds like a cool book.
Miracle cures. Yeah, I got to include like some historical anecdotes in Nutrivore. I would love to just do a book that's just like all just like the history of these discoveries and how they link with like the culture at the time, how certain things became miracle cures, other things became demonized, but all of it, like the common theme is all of it happening before the really good quality studies. We've seen this in the history of USDA dietary guidelines, right? Where there's things in that guidelines that are not what the science says. And then when you do even more science, you see, no, unequivocally, we do not need 6 to 11 servings of grains per day. That is clearly not the way we want to go. And I think that is a challenge that we have even now, is that sure, there's lots that we can say with a very high degree of certainty, right? We do have 230 years of science to go off of now at this point. But we still have this tendency to new shiny object, turn it into a miracle cure, right? Oh, look at this cool fat in dairy products. Now let me turn it into a supplement and sell it as like, this is going to cure all of your whatever it is, right? We still have this like, we're going to make assumptions based on preliminary data. And that is if we could just get rid of that aspect of how we talk about nutrition, how we talk about supplements, how we talk about discoveries, I think that would go a long way. If we could get rid of the sensational headlines, right?
Yeah.
Coffee is killing you. Coffee is the best thing ever, right? If we could just get rid of like the clickbait headlines every time a new study comes out, and instead just talk about how that study fits into the body of scientific literature that already exists, that would make a huge difference to just how we talk about food and supplements and where those can fit in.
Yeah, to tone down or eliminate the fear, and to tone down or eliminate the sensationalism,
and show people how the scientific process applies to nutrition, right? So I think one of the things that the sort of average person feels really frustrated about is, well, you told me this about nutrition and now it's this, right? Now, some of that is, well, it was like a game of wellness influencer telephone based on, right, some science over there that then became really morphed, and it's now become a different thing, and it's not correct.
But it's not just from influencers. It's from,
or from doctors, or,
Harvard,
from,
Tufts,
yeah.
like Lucky Charms are better for you than eggs,
Oh, the food compass.
The food compass,
The food compass could be really interesting.
I've actually had conversations with Dietary from Tufts. I believe it's the Friedman School of Nutrition. He's a very reasonable guy, but that food compass was a sham.
Well, it is still being developed. So to be fair, the Lucky Charms being more nutrient dense than like beef or hard-boiled eggs being like the same as like pineapple canned in heavy syrup, like those comparisons come from their paper basically saying, yo, we've still got some work to do. Like, we're not ready for prime time. What they're trying to do is combine something like the NOVA classification system with something like the Nutrivore score. So they're trying to come up with a scoring system that both reflects the level of processing of a food and the presence of additives and the nutrient density. And I think that's a really interesting idea. Obviously, it's not ready for prime time. Like, that clearly, if Lucky Charms is scoring twice as high as beef, we've got some issues, because it's really like it's obviously over penalizing animal foods in a way that's not reflected by the scientific literature. But I think it's a really interesting idea. Like, I would love to see that further developed. I think there is a world where that could be a like really valuable number.
Yeah, for front of package labeling.
Yeah.
But you just know that in today's world, it's going to be corrupted.
Potentially. I think, there's other things that
I mean, have you seen this? I shared it on my Instagram and my X account recently. It went viral. It was just a bunch of cereal boxes with the red heart check logo on it. Like, it was like Fruit Loops. Let me see if I can pull it up. It was just crazy.
And it's because they have oats. Or something. Some
degree of whole grain. I mean, but let's like.
Wouldn't it be nice if you could only get that heart check if you had a study showing, at least, it doesn't have to be a long study, right? It could be a 6-week study where people eat that food and they lower their cholesterol.
That thing. So you got Trix, Cocoa Puffs, Lucky Charms, and what is that? French Toast Crunch, all with the red. So I was recording a podcast with a dietitian recently, and I was like, this would be a fun experiment, maybe for like a documentary or something, where you go to the supermarket, and in your shopping cart, you put all of the items that are adorned with this logo, and then you eat those for 6 months. Like, I wonder what would...
So it's really interesting looking at all-cause mortality. Cereal, in general, reduces it. That effect is driven by whole grain cereals. But sugary breakfast cereals have a neutral effect on all-cause mortality, which is really fascinating and probably reflective of the fortification, because it's actually supplying, a lot of those are actually supplying a good amount of B vitamins and iron in people's diets who are probably not getting those nutrients.
What's the Nutrivore score of Cocoa Puffs?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head, but fortification would bring it up, right? So I don't know. I would have to look it up. I don't even know if I would have the nutrition, like enough data to calculate the score. I don't even know if it's in my database, but there's 8,000 foods in my database. I don't have the whole thing memorized.
What's your database? Like the USDA?
So I use USDA Food Central database as my primary data set. And then my team and I spent about a year basically trying to track down as much additional data as possible. So we used Phenol Explorer for polyphenols, but it's not awesome. So we spent a lot of time like scouring scientific studies that go, polyphenol content of 6 varieties of apple, right? And then we would find, okay, well, that's a variety of apple that we can match to something in the USDA. Let's add that. So that's how we have data for like CoQ10 and taurine and thiosulfonates and glucosinolates and all of these different classes of phytonutrient is from scouring individual scientific papers. And I have a shout out to Lisa, who manages the database, because she has a background she used to work for a pharmaceutical company where she did mostly documentation. So when she took over this project for me and was like, I don't understand your notes. And I'm like, well, that's iodine, right? Like, she's like, oh, okay. She took it over and went super methodical with it. And every single number has a reference to where the number came from in our master database. So we can track every number back to its original source. I was not I was not, my original development in the database was not that rigorous, but Lisa has made sure that it is so documented that a scientist could pick it up and go, okay, this and this and this.
That's so cool. Is there a healthiest apple?
Crab apples, technically, are the most nutrient dense.
Are they the small ones?
Those are the small ones, yeah. And I don't think they're very, very bitter, right?
Yeah, well, it's like the ancestral apple.
Yeah, they are the original. So if you can't get crab apples or don't like the stomach ache from eating too many of them raw, Granny Smiths are the next
the green ones.
Yeah, I mean, basically because, so the Nutrivore score is calculated as the sum of 33 nutrients put in the context of their recommended dietary intake, or for something non-essential, we've created recommended targets that are based on studies that go, okay, if you get over 500 milligrams of polyphenols per day, you have this kind of reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. So we've tried to set some kind of context for those nutrients. So the sum of 33 nutrients relative to their recommended dietary intake, so basically percent daily value divided by the energy density. So if you've got a food that has less sugar in it, like a Granny Smith apple compared to a Fuji or a Gala, you've got a lower denominator. So even if it has really similar nutrients, it'll bump up the nutrient density because it's just an artifact of the calculation. If you define nutrient density as nutrients per calorie, which is how it has been scientifically defined for 25 years, then calories are part of that conversation. And that's why so many very low energy density foods can score really high, because you don't need as much nutrients to have high nutrient density if you are 2 or 3 calories per serving.
Well, it's like dark leafy greens continually are at the top of the list.
So the highest Nutrivore score food is canned clam liquid.
Canned clam liquid?
Yeah. We're not starting a trend of drinking canned clam liquid here. This is not a miracle food. I would have never guessed that.
What are the nutrients in canned clam liquid?
So a cup of canned clam liquid has 500% of your daily value of vitamin B12.
Whoa.
So
excluding the clams.
Right. And you can buy, it's also called clam juice, right? You can buy it just straight. Also, it has a lot of sodium. So I would recommend, if you want to incorporate clam juice into your routine, to get the low sodium version, right? But it's an ingredient, clam chowder, like linguine with clam sauce. It's half of Clamato.
Wow.
Caesars. But yeah, so it's got a good amount of a bunch of other vitamins and minerals, and 9 calories per cup or something like that, right?
That's so weird.
Cool. Yeah, so it's just, it's kind of like an artifact of the math that something like that scores so high. That's also why watercress is so high, and rainbow chard and collard greens and mustard greens and kale. Those are all foods that have pretty low energy density and also still a lot of valuable nutrition. I would say 500% of the daily value of vitamin B12 is, wow, that's kind of impressive, right?
Yeah.
And so, these leafy greens often have 200-300% of the daily value of vitamin K, and then a pretty good amount of folate and biotin and vitamin C, and then, some fiber, some polyphenols, some carotenoids, right? So those are all the things that are going into the numerator in that math, and then low energy density, so you get a higher number. And it's why when we're using the Nutrivore score, I always say, let's compare similar foods, right? Let's not use this number to compare kale to liver. Their nutrient densities are almost identical, but liver is going to give you 50% or more of the daily value of 11 nutrients in a serving, and kale is going to give you 50% more of the daily value of 3 nutrients in a serving, right? Because you're going to get more calories in your serving of liver than you're getting calories worth of your serving of kale. So you're just getting more nutrients when you eat that liver than you are for that kale. They're both great foods, but they also don't play the same role in our meal, right? We're going to look at what could I eat instead of that, kale that could give me similar or different nutrients. What could I eat instead of that liver that would give me similar or different nutrients? What's fascinating is that oysters have almost the same nutrient profile as liver.
Wow.
I know. That was pleasant information for me. I would far rather eat oysters than liver any day.
I like both.
I like liver, but I really like oysters, right?
Oysters are great.
Oysters are awesome. So the Nutrivore score has some really fun math, and so I think practically we want to use it just to look at simple swaps or little additions, right? It helps show how valuable it is to add some, chopped chives to our meal, or throw in a side of mushrooms, right? It shows us the little things that we can add that can add a lot of nutrition. But my favorite way to use it is redemption arcs, right? It's the foods that have a reputation for being nutritionally poor, like iceberg lettuce, which we call crunchy water, that's actually more nutrient dense than celery or artichoke or cucumber.
Wow.
And it's not as nutrient dense as other lettuce types. If you like other lettuce, you'll get more nutrients from romaine or leaf lettuce. But iceberg lettuce is still a really nutritionally valuable food.
Wow, good to know.
Yeah. So we could grab Nutrivore scores of different types of breakfast cereal. I know the ones that fare the best are the whole grain ones that also have just a mess load of fortification. Unfortunately, I don't have detailed enough data to be able to separate out added nutrients from inherent nutrients. So that's not a piece of information that I have that I can put into my calculation, because I would find that really interesting. Like, what is the base score of Lucky Charms? And then what is the score with the fortification? Wouldn't that be fascinating to know?
Well, I'm glad that we have fortification,
Yeah, fortification has some pretty good, so it's three main success stories are pretty dramatic reductions in iron deficiency anemia, in goiter thanks to iodized table salt, and in neural tube defects due to folate.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's making a dent. I don't think fortification has been around so long. I think it'd be really hard to figure out if it's making a dent in cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes, but we do have some measurable success stories from it, and in a context where most people aren't getting the nutrients they need, wherever they can get them, I think is good.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming out and allaying some of the fears around some of these foods. I'm going to continue to prioritize organic for foods where I eat the skin, the peel, the leaf. But I completely concede that we shouldn't be afraid of conventionally grown produce. Yeah. And if that's all you have access to, still.
Oh, it's so much better. I mean, if you just think about the
rinse
studies,
it well. Are you a fan of these vegetable washes? I actually recently picked one up. It's like baking soda or salt or something, but there's data that suggests that they actually do.
So my grandmother used to wash everything in a sink of lightly salted water, and that's a habit that I picked up from being a child. So I love seeing that reduces. I mean, for me, actually, the thing that I think is a bigger concern with produce, it's equal concern with conventional versus organic, is the risk of foodborne illness. There's a much bigger, and it's got a whole new can of worms right as we're wrapping up. But that also dramatically reduces the risk of salmonella or E. coli. I mean, basically just rinsing your food can get rid of a large proportion of pesticide residues, as well as potential microbes that we do not want. So but I haven't gotten into the weeds of all of the different food rinses and washes and whether. No,
but you're right. The salt works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm super, super appreciative. I'm still going to prioritize extra virgin olive oil. I'm not, bringing soybean oil into my house anytime soon, but I don't fear it when I'm out, in restaurants. Although that being said, I don't eat fried food very often. Yeah, I think this is all adding valuable nuance to the conversation. And it's okay also to not necessarily agree on every point.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But I think nuance is what we need.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think rather than saying good and bad, we could say good and better.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think if we can change that type of language, I think we can, because when we're scaring people away from really nutritionally important foods, by trying to make the thing that's good seem bad rather than make the thing that's better seem better, and also but the other thing is still good, right? I think that is where the argument is basically shooting all of us in the foot. And so having that nuance and being able to meet people where they are and help them take those first steps, I mean, that's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I got one last question before we get to that. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they pick up Nutrivore?
Nutrivore, the radical new science for getting the nutrients you need from the food you eat, is available wherever books are sold. Might be a copy at your local library, and if there's not, put in a request for it, and the librarian can get it in.
Hell yeah.
And my home base is Nutrivore.com. That's where you can read the 12,000-word article about vegetable oils. Click on the myth-busting icon, and the article will be right there. But lots of other really fascinating. If you want to learn everything that CoQ10 does in the body, you can learn that there, or any other of 60 some odd nutrients that I have articles for on the site. It's where you can learn about foods and learn about all of the cool things that different foods have in them and the health benefits of different foods. So a website I promise you can get lost in for days. But if you go to that top menu on the right and click on join, That's where you will find my free newsletter that sends bite-sized information. If 12,000 words is maybe not your jam, and my feelings are not hurt, if you'd like bite-sized information about what nutrients do in the body and what foods have them, that's available in a weekly newsletter that's free. And that's where you can also link to my social media. But also, wherever your social platform is, I'm probably there as @Dr. Sarah Ballantyne.
Love it. Do people still find you from your old like Paleo Mom website, which I noticed is still up?
Yeah, we're working on stripping it for parts so that we can fully archive it. But it's a slow process.
And I'm assuming you've completely relinquished that whole brand for yourself.
Yes, no, and it's still up for sort of technical reasons, but we are making steps towards pulling everything of value off of it and migrating it so that we can shut it down.
So cool.
No, I mean, that site, I can tell you, gets very little traffic now because I haven't promoted it for years and years and years. I don't drive traffic to it at all. So it still technically exists, but it's pretty quiet. It's like the tumbleweeds going through through. Yeah.
It's like dead naming somebody. It's
right.
Like you're not,
yeah.
No.
So Nutrivore has poached all of the traffic, and that was the intention all along. So
love it. Well, super excited to learn even more. Last question that gets asked everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you?
I feel like my decisions always center around happiness. And so to me, it's making smart decisions that increase how happy I feel, that increase the moments of joy in my life, that make me laugh when my kid says a stupid joke. I don't laugh when my husband says a stupid joke because they're not funny. He's not listening to this. But yeah, it's right. It's all of those things that increase that baseline, right? How do I feel when the phone's put away and there's nothing stimulating and I'm just alone in my own thoughts? What is my baseline emotion? I want that to be happiness. It's not always, right? Like that's I don't know if that's even a realistic expectation, but that's the goal.
Amen. I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.